And welcome to a special on-location EWTN Bookmark show. I'm Doug Keck, sitting here with our special guest author and show host, Father Timothy M. Gallagher. And the book is Overcoming Spiritual Discouragement, the Wisdom and Spiritual Power of Venerable Bruno Lanteri. Always great to see you, Father.
Thanks, Doug.
Great to spend some time with you. Now, this is a name that obviously is very familiar to you. We did a book on it, I remember several years ago. But who is Venerable Bruno Lanteri, and why should people care about him and his life?
He was an Italian priest who died in 1830. Of course, I came into contact with him as the founder of my religious community, the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. But I'd say for several things, his teaching gets more and more important today. The theme of this book, Overcoming Spiritual Discouragement, all we have to do is enunciate that theme, and that's going to resonate with a lot of us, because there is a lot of discouragement out there in the world and even in the church. And so a practical, down-to-earth, boots-on-the-ground sort of teaching on how to deal with this is getting more and more valuable for people today. He also lived in very hard times for the church during the French Revolution and the aftermath, and is a model of courage in a time when it was not easy to be courageous in the church. Also his love for the Ignatian spiritual exercises, his clear teaching on prayer, on holiness and the lay vocation. So there are many facets to a valuable spirituality.
So do you owe that connection to your mom?
I do, in a sense, in that she was the one that first read about the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, showed me this little article that she'd read, and that's how the whole thing began.
Now you say Venerable Bruno quickly began to draw me in a powerful way. How and why?
These things you can't always explain in the spiritual life. You know, why do you feel so powerfully drawn to this saint or that spirituality or these different practices? So I can't explain it other than it was God's grace at work in my life. Everybody knew that then seminarian Tim Gallagher was the one to talk to if you wanted to know more about Venerable Bruno Lanteri, because he was into that sort of thing. And that just increased as I went on to graduate studies in theology and beyond.
Well, it's interesting because you make the point about you focusing on that, and you say Vatican II would ask that religious communities renew themselves according to their founder's spirit and special aims. So was that part of your interest in him?
It was happening. I was in the seminary in the 70s, so this is the immediate aftermath of the council. And in our community, as in others, studies were being done, his writings were being published in new ways. So there was this new unearthing of a richness, and that was exactly the time when this passion just developed in me for this, and that came together and led to these studies.
Well, it must have been passionate. You were living in Italy. You actually learned what? At least 2, if not 3 languages, so you could study this, right?
Venerable Bruno wrote and spoke 3 languages, Italian, French, and Latin. So I had to learn all 3, and later German as well, because there was a German connection in all of this.
Right. Now, you said, I gave talks to our novices about the life and spirituality of Venerable Bruno. Time passed in my oblate ministry led me to publish a series of books on Ignatian's theme. Then one day, our provincial asked me to write a biography of Venerable Bruno, and you said yes. Is that the book we did in the past?
That's the book we did, yes.
So where does this fit in your book series on him?
This present book that we
Yeah, right, exactly.
The biography takes you year by year through his life chronologically. Of course, you learn a lot about him as we go through that and we explore his spiritual writings. But what this book does is to take a single theme in his spiritual teaching and put the reader in direct access to Venerable Bruno, almost as if you met with him for spiritual direction. And if you felt some discouragement somewhere in your spiritual life and you come to this wise, holy priest, how would he respond to you? That's essentially what you're getting here. So that this book, I would say, even more than the biography, gives you almost immediate, direct access to the heart of this man as a spiritual figure, which is really what we most want in every saint.
You said that you lived in Venerable Bruno's world, his culture, his times, his concerns. That immersion decisively changed my understanding of him. How?
During the 5 years that I dedicated to writing this, now those 5 years come after having done a doctoral thesis on him and years of teaching and so forth, but for those 5 years, all of my reading, all of my study, eventually all of my writing was focused on this period of time, the late 18th century, early 19th century in Europe, the struggles of the popes and the church, the French Revolution, its aftermath, Napoleon, all of this. And that was really valuable because then it gave me a feel for him, a much more intimate feeling than I'd ever been able to have before.
Well, and you say, I now saw not only his heroism and single-mindedness, but his struggles, the disappointments, the physical burdens, the pain of loss, in a sense, the human side, which is, I had long admired his strength, but it was his weaknesses that finally won me over completely to him.
When friends meet and one friend feels the trust now to share with another a burden or a struggle, you know how that brings friends very close together. So yes, I had long admired the heroic side. I mean, the church has declared the heroicity of his virtues. That's why he's called venerable. But I had never seen so clearly just the human side, the struggle. Terrible struggles with health throughout all the years of his life, prostrated at times, unable to use his eyes. And by an unjust order of the French police at age 57, stripped of all priestly ministry, exiled, an exile he never expected to survive physically, bereft of all friendship, all support. So all of these dealing with the persecutions of the church, knowing that he had to put his life on the line, which he did. So and times of discouragement from which he had to rebound and so forth. When you see all of this, then he's no longer a plaster of Paris statue. He's a living, breathing, he's my brother, he's our brother. Well, he knows our struggles. Death's in his family.
That's what Mother Angelica always wanted to make sure people understood. Saints were real people.
Well, that's what happened as I got close to him in this way, and he really, as I say, really won me over.
Let's say, never give in to discouragement. Lift your heart and immediately to God, who loves you so. Where did he get that insight and strength from?
The insight probably came initially through, he had a wonderful spiritual director and wide reading and so forth, but this was the insight. You know how we get discouraged at times? Look what I did it again. I never seem to get better. I felt maybe it's serious sometimes even, maybe less so, but it's always discouraging. And the spontaneous reaction can be just to sort of give in, you know. The energy just sort of fades away from us somehow. And here's his response: no. There is never anything you can have done, nowhere you can ever have been in the spiritual life, that can ever stop you right now in this moment from just turning to God, and you'll find an infinite love there, an eagerness to forgive if forgiveness is necessary, and begin again. I've seen that teaching make such a difference in so many people's lives, beginning with my own.
Right.
There's never any reason to remain locked in.
Because didn't your father die while you were writing the book, Begin Again?
Yes, it was a difficult time then. Of course, then my mom, was in a difficult situation. So humanly speaking, it was a pressured time.
Right. So you experienced discouragement.
Oh, yeah, like all of us.
Right.
When I say sometimes that all of us know this kind of experience, I don't exempt myself in this. And part of what I write comes out of applying this kind of wisdom to my own experience. Right,
because you talk about how complications led to, you had multiple surgeries on your vocal cords. Over the next several years, 4 more vocal surgeries followed, each one accompanied by temporary loss of my voice. As the cycle repeated again and again, I grew discouraged. I wondered if I had ever returned to normal life in ministry. And then you made a decision, right?
It was 3 years of repeated surgeries, and each more discouraging than the last. And I wish it hadn't taken me 3 years, but finally something dawned on me. Look, there's a prayer for the intercession of Venerable Bruno. Why don't you say that, asking his intercession with your voice? And that was 6 years ago. Since then, I've said that prayer every morning. I've had no more vocal surgeries. Of course, you hear me talking as I'm doing now. I have to be a little careful because I've had the surgeries, but it doesn't hinder ministry at all. And you can bet I'm going to say that prayer for his intercession for that reason every day of my life till I die.
Right.
Of course, there are other intentions added now to it.
Right. You say, as occurrences multiply, I could not but see the hand of Venerable Bruno in response to this daily prayer. On a lesser note, knowing Venerable Bruno's love for reading, I have long asked his help when I need to find the right book for some occasion. The prayer, too, I constantly find it's answered.
You need a book for some spiritual need or some study or whatever it might be. And I'll always, if I go into a bookstore or a library, I'll always ask his intercession. He was a genius at this in his own life, knew books in and out, knew how to find the right book for the right person. I've always found that prayer answered too.
Living with Hope, Chapter 1, say then with boldness, do not look back so often because one who looks back cannot run.
Sometimes when I share these with a group, I will pantomime that. Just try it sometime. Look back and try to run forward. People start laughing, but it makes the point. He's writing to a discouraged woman. This is in January at the beginning of a new year, and he's saying to her, don't keep looking back at your failures in the past. Start looking forward, because that's the only thing that's going to, and look forward with hope.
Right. The great obstacle in spiritual life is discouragement. For those who love the Lord and sincerely try with all their failings to follow him, this is a great danger. As Venerable Bruno begins here, be on guard against discouragement. Yes, strive to do well in all that you do, but do it with respect for your own humanity.
All right, two things there. I think he's absolutely right. And I think anyone listening can ask him or herself, is he right when he says that discouragement is the greatest obstacle in the spiritual life? Something happens, we get disheartened, we can start to think of pulling back on this, that, or the other thing spiritually. I think he's absolutely right. That discouragement is the key obstacle. And of course, the teaching which helps overcome it is going to be absolutely important for us. And then, what are the means? Get concrete about it. Be practical. And you'll see, of course, as you've gone through the book, you've seen that he gets very specific about this.
Not does God ask you to strive for an impossible perfection. Rather, focus simply on the day at hand. Do what God has given you to do for today. That is enough. That is your path to holiness, all you need. Mother always talked about living in the present moment. That same kind of idea, right?
So here's a mother raising young children, all kinds of concerns, worries about this, that, and the other thing. What she has, or any one of us in our own vocations, what she has is today. These children, these occupations, this is where grace is, this is where God is, this is where holiness is pursued. Live today, and live it with the Lord. Leave the past, as he says, to God's mercy and the future to his providence. Good place for both of them, and live today.
This one can be tough. Show yourself joyful even when you do not feel so because of physical problems.
When I was going through those surgeries during those 3 years, I took that line and typed it up and taped it on the wall of my room because I needed to see it every day because I didn't feel very good physically. Yes, there's a kind of heroism in this. We can give in to those things, pull back, weigh on other people. And here's the injunction. Show yourself joyful. Not only, not dour and complaining, but show yourself joyful when you don't, even when you don't feel so for physical reasons. Imagine if we did that in the family.
Right, exactly. You talk about that when we fail out of weakness, out of tiredness, out of the failure to understand a situation, and for similar reasons, this is our human condition, but try with a holy persistence never to offend God knowingly with your eyes open. And that was his point too.
He'll say this over and over again when he invites people to really seek sanctity. Understand that your sanctity is going to be in the midst of defects. That's the only kind of sanctity that's possible to us. And God loves us, knows the human condition, shared it even in the incarnation. So don't be discouraged when you see the defects. That's the kind of holiness that God is calling us to.
It's very important, he talks about, you say, what has such importance that we understand deeply how good God is and that we not measure him by our own limitations.
Sure, so here's a person who is always late. Here's a person who says, I'll have this done, and we already know it's probably not going to be done on time. We lose patience fairly quickly with a person like this. And what Venerable Bruno is saying is we can tend to think that God's like that with us. We judge him by our own human standard. And so he says it's very important to know that God is not like that. He's a Father who never loses patience, whose goodness, whose love, whose tenderness is always right there. Right. If we can understand God the way he truly is, then a lot of hope comes into the spiritual journey.
It says, do not let yourself be troubled by anything, not even by your own failings. By anything, not even your own failings. Often it is precisely our own failings that trouble us the most.
Sure, that's Peter in the boat in Luke 5 after the catch of the fish. Now he knows the divine is close to him in Jesus of Nazareth. And what does he say? Depart from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. I'm sinful. I can't be this close to you. We often readily have that fear. It's the fear of ourselves and our own failings. And so he says, don't let yourself be discouraged. And he'll say this over and over again, not even by your own failings. Let's dream of a spiritual life in which we don't let ourselves get discouraged by our own failings, but keep coming back to God, knowing that he joyfully receives us, lovingly forgives us, and we begin right away again.
What does he mean by heroic hope?
When we see the failures over and over again, there he's speaking to a person who is discouraged about her own spiritual life and just her repeated failures. I fell into the same impatience with the children again today. I just didn't reach out to that person at work or contribute in the parish in the way that I could have, and so forth. Over and over again. There is a heroism in just refusing to give up hope that God can really lead us forward on this path. Because we have a choice. When we see these failings in ourselves, I have them, we all have them. We can either settle for less, which said reverently sometimes we do. Well, that's as much as I can hope for. Here are all the saints, here are even these wonderful people that I know, but this is probably as far as I'm going to get. Or we can have heroic hope. We can turn to God and say, all things are possible. I can do all things in him who loves me, strengthens me, as Paul says, and then refuse to lower the hope in our lives to respond fully to the Lord in the way that he's calling us to respond.
Right. He says here, your affliction in regard to the past has no basis. It is simply a temptation of the enemy.
Imagine what it must have meant for that woman to get that letter from a man like this, whom she revered for the holy man that he was. So he knew this woman. He knew that she could dwell on the past and her failings. He also knew her enough to know that there was no real substance to this. And so he uses very firm language there. I can firmly assure you that it's just a temptation. There's nothing in this. And resist it the way we resist any temptation. Firmly reject it. Turn your hope toward God today. Live your spiritual life now with freedom.
And this is always interesting too. As the same enemy, Venerable Bruno continues, will also try to afflict you regarding the future. Look at you. Look at how little progress you've made this last year.
Yes. So the enemy in the present, if we don't uncover this tactic of the enemy, so right now I'm feeling discouraged. If we allow the enemy free sway, well, it's like putting on a pair of dark sunglasses. You look back, everything looks dark. You look forward, everything looks dark. Take the sunglasses off, uncover the discouraging lies of the enemy, and you find out that it's nowhere near as dark as the enemy would want you to believe. So it's very important that we see clearly that the enemy will attempt to predict our spiritual future, and it will always be dark. You're never going to be much of a woman of prayer, but it's all a lie.
Now, I know in your other books, we talk about the idea that the enemy gets you at your weak point. It seems to be this kind of thing is a weak point for just about everybody.
Well, we all have a humanity which is imperfect, and we go back to what he said. Understand that the sanctity to which you're called is a sanctity in this humanity, in these real conditions. So yes, there's a vulnerability there for all of us in our individual nuances, certainly, but all of us have a common vulnerability there, and all of us have a common answer to it.
God and the enemy, two contrasting approaches. The enemy seeks to strip you of your peace, to weaken your confidence in God, to burden you, to discourage you. Have you felt this? This is not God's voice. God speaks to your heart. Let nothing disturb you, not even your own failings.
Jesus says, I am gentle and lowly of heart. Come to me, learn of me. Any person who is sincerely seeking God, and that includes the just man who falls 7 times a day, as Scripture says, who needs to ask God's forgiveness at the beginning of every Mass and so forth, needs, as I do, the sacrament of reconciliation in our lives. Any person who is in this situation knows that the Lord's love and the forgiveness is there. It's always there, and this need never stop us.
Right. Do not be concerned if prayer does not go as you would wish. It is enough that it be as God wishes.
Yeah, I love that line, because we all have an image of our prayer as pretty well, this is a bit of a caricature, but I'm consistently concentrated, my heart is engaged, my thoughts are centered on this, and then I may find that I'm tired and distracted. It's hard to even stay the full time that I mentioned and the rest. That's all human experience. God understands it. His love is there for us in it.
Also, it says here, one of the most helpful counsels regarding prayer I have found is from St. Teresa of Avila. After the wealth of teaching she gives on prayer, St. Teresa says that in the end, having a growing prayer life depends on one thing, fidelity, just never give up.
It's what Venerable Bruno repeatedly calls a holy tenacity. So basically it's this: learn from the Church's tradition different ways of praying. So it could be Lectio Divina, the Rosary, the Liturgy of the Hours, Ignatian meditation, contemplation, so forth. Make wise choices about the means that work best for you. Make wise choices about when and how much time you're going to give to them. And then don't give up. There's the holy tenacity, persevere. And that's exactly what St. Teresa of Avila says, which this has meant a lot to me in my own life, because sometimes we'll look at our daily prayer and feel like it's, well, I wish it were here, but it seems like it's less than it ought to be. That injunction from St. Teresa, just if you want to have a growing life of prayer, this is the one single thing that's most important. Just don't ever stop praying, day in, day out, in, year out. Keep praying, and you will have a growing life of prayer. So this is a kind of a leitmotif for Venerable Bruno, too.
Well, it's interesting, too, the word fidelity. We think of that today, and fidelity being so important. And it seems like in our culture, the idea of fidelity isn't held in high regard as it used to be.
It's pretty key. It's pretty close to the classic virtue of fortitude. You know, being firm and constant, the Catechism says. Those two words which it uses to describe that virtue, firm, not giving way, and then constant, firm over time, over the years. It's a grace to pray for. It is difficult, especially in the discouraging times, but we do our best with that. If we can be faithful, firm, persevering with all of our struggles, then God's grace is going to work.
Right. It seems like sometimes in the culture today, it's kind of the idea, as we're talking about, we shouldn't be discouraged when we fail. There's a certain amount of, well, what does it matter really at the end, because God will forgive me, he knows I did the best I could.
Well, I'd say right from those very words that God does ask precisely that, does ask us to do the best we can. Now, this is going a little far afield. There's a rather telling line in The Servant of God, Walter Chiswick, you know, the Jesuit who spent those 23 years in Siberian labor camps and so on. And his phrase is this, he used this in retreat talks, do your lousy best. Do your lousy best. Now that, he was sort of a brass tacks, you know, kind of a gruff sort of guy. Our best is not going to be perfect, but it's our best, and that's all God asks.
Right, but it should be our best. And not that we're trying to convince ourselves that it was our best. If you wish to recognize the enemy, even when he presents himself under the appearance of good, note whether what he proposes causes discouragement when he proposes it, because this is a sure sign of hidden temptation. It's
a key tool for discernment. So I'm thinking of doing this, presuming a person, basically just a person who loves the Lord, with all of our struggles, as we're saying, but sincerely loves the Lord. Here is a choice, here is an option, here is something I could do or let go or begin to take up. All right, Venerable Bruno says, be attentive to what stirs in your heart as you're considering this. Does it energize you, awaken hope and a new sense of God's love and closeness? Or is there a certain sinking in your heart, a certain sense of discouragement, a certain flattening out? Be attentive if there is, because that's probably a sign that this is not of the good spirit.
How do you discern between your emotions and actual spiritual growth?
That's a point that we take up in some detail in the other writing we've talked about, you know, about Ignatian discernment of spirits. Some things are just very obviously on the human. I'll just give one simple example, but this has to be applied, you know, broadly. I'm feeling discouraged. I put on some cheerful music. I feel better. Good, healthy human thing to do, but that's on the natural level. I'm feeling discouraged. I go to church, sit there before the Lord, and pray a psalm, let's say. And even though I walk in a dark valley, I fear no evil. You are with me with your rod and your staff. They give me courage, and my heart lifts. Now we're on the spiritual level there.
Okay.
So a person who is living the spiritual life can learn to see those distinctions.
The distinctions there. I recommend that you renew more than ever and very often the holy presumption of desiring from the Lord the grace to reach the holiness you would have attained had you always been faithful to his grace.
I'm so glad you highlighted that one. I love that one, because what he's saying to this woman who, like so many of us, as she looks at herself, is discouraged. I've lost opportunities in my life. I've missed them. I could have profited, but I didn't. So I'm never going to reach the full holiness that God is calling me to. And he says to her, no, have this. This is a holy presumption, a virtuous presumption of seeking from the Lord and hoping from the Lord all the holiness that the Lord would have given you if you had never failed once in your life to respond to his call.
Now, early in the book, you were reading about Venerable Bruno and said, this man is a saint. Well, he's a venerable. So where is his cause at this point?
The heroicity of his virtues has been affirmed by the Church. His writings have been found free of error. All that we need is a miracle attributed to his intercession for his beatification and a second for his canonization.
Right. So can anybody find out more about him or any way they can help in his
Yes,
cause?
if a person wants to do a web search for my community, Oblates of the Virgin Mary, our website will come up, or even just do simply a web search for Bruno Lanteri, and the website will come up. All the information is there, the prayers, places in which you can send in intentions or share word of graces received.
When you do, because you host series for us, you write books, which comes first most of the time?
Series or books?
Yeah.
Both come together because almost all of the series that we've done have been series based on a book that I've done.
Right. So in a sense, you write the book and then you use how you teach what's in that book.
That's
as a
usually how
series
that's usually how it
presentation.
happens.
Which do you think is more powerful, have you found? Or have you found people reacting different depending on whether they've just read it in the book or they've seen the series?
People have different learning styles. So some approaches, some are more visual, some are more visual, some in terms of reading. Probably, it's just hard for me to give a figure, but I would say the written word, the digital form, podcasts and so forth, and then the visual in terms of television, together are powerful.
Okay, well, great. See, we can use the media for the right things to calm anxiety and not add to it. Very good. Overcoming Spiritual Discouragement, a book for our times. We can say the wisdom and spiritual power of Venerable Bruno Lanteri has meant a lot to Father. He'll probably mean a lot to you. The book published proudly by EWTN Publishing, available through our religious catalog. EWTNRC.com, of course, is the place to find it. Thank you so much for joining us for this special on-location bookmark. Thanks.